Horrific murders. Investigation process. Portrait of the perpetrator. Motive for the crime. Final verdict. Welcome to Mysterious Case. September 23rd, 2015, Bristol, United Kingdom. A peaceful residential area was suddenly disrupted by screams of agony and panic. It was around 3 a.m. The neighbors jolted awake as lights flickered on one by one in the surrounding apartments. Some peeked through their windows, searching for the source of the desperate cries. What they saw on the quiet street below left them so stunned they could hardly believe their eyes. A man wearing nothing but his underwear staggered out of the darkness, trembling. His body was in a horrifying state. Thick, dark liquid clung to his skin, dripping onto the pavement like melted wax. Some initially assumed it was mud or that he had escaped a fire. But as the streetlight illuminated him, the horrifying truth was revealed. It wasn't mud. His flesh was melting right before their eyes. "Help me! She threw acid on me!" The words that escaped the victim's lips sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. A neighbor who had barely managed to throw on a coat stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. Another, thinking it might be some kind of sick joke, rushed forward, only to recoil instantly, vomiting in shock onto the pavement. For those who could bear to look closely, the man's condition was worse than any nightmare they had ever imagined. Large sections of his face, chest, arms, and legs had been severely corroded, exposing raw red flesh beneath. The areas most heavily attacked had already begun turning black, a telltale sign of necrosis. His eyes, now barely recognizable, were reduced to hollow sockets, with his left eyeball seemingly burned away entirely. Despite his excruciating pain, the man struggled to speak, his voice warped and weak. "She, Berlina Wallace, my ex-girlfriend." Within minutes, an ambulance raced onto the scene, its flashing lights slicing through the darkness. Paramedics rushed to the victim, immediately dousing him with cold water in a desperate attempt to halt the acid's devastating effects. But the damage was already catastrophic. One medic froze momentarily upon realizing that the victim's left cheek had been completely eroded away, exposing the bare bone of his jaw. Thus began the nightmare that engulfed Bristol that night, a horror that no one in the quiet neighborhood would ever forget. But for the victim, his life would never return to what it once was. Mark Van Dongen had only just entered the beginning of a 15-month-long ordeal, a waking nightmare where he would battle unimaginable physical and emotional torment. Welcome back to Mysterious Case, where thrilling, dark, and mysterious cases are brought to life through captivating stories. Are you someone who enjoys delving into crimes, dangerous criminals, real-life cases, and the chilling hidden corners of society? Congratulations, you've come to the right place. Like and follow the channel to ensure you don't miss any gripping cases. Your support is the driving force that motivates us to keep delivering high-quality content. Thank you, and now let's dive into today's case. Before becoming the victim of one of the most brutal acid attacks in the UK, Mark Van Dongen was a man full of ambition, a talented engineer, a devoted son, and above all, a man who believed in love. A belief that in the end led him to an irreversible tragedy. Born in 1987 in the Netherlands to a warm and loving middle-class family, Mark was raised by his father, Cornelius Van Dongen, who instilled in him the values of kindness, compassion, and perseverance. Those who knew Mark remembered him as a boy with a generous heart, always willing to help his friends, even if it meant sacrificing his own interests. One childhood story that his father often recounted was the time when Mark won a rare marble in a schoolyard game. However, upon seeing his classmate on the verge of tears after losing, Mark quietly placed the marble in the boy's hand and smiled, saying, "You can keep it." That was Mark Van Dongen, a person who gave without expecting anything in return. With a sharp intellect and a passion for science, Mark pursued civil engineering at a prestigious university in the Netherlands. During his studies, he not only excelled academically, but also demonstrated remarkable leadership and determination. His professors and classmates firmly believed he had a bright future ahead of him in the field. After completing his studies, Mark made the bold decision to leave the Netherlands in search of new opportunities. He chose Bristol, United Kingdom, a rapidly growing city with promising career prospects for young, ambitious engineers. For Mark, moving to the UK wasn't just about advancing his career, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one he hoped would be filled with new experiences, professional success, and ultimately, true love. Upon arriving in Bristol, Mark quickly established a stable life. He secured a highly coveted position at a leading engineering firm, where his colleagues and supervisors held him in high regard. Those who worked alongside Mark described him as diligent, dedicated, and incredibly intelligent, yet humble and kind-hearted. He had a passion for sports, particularly cycling, a hobby he had maintained for years. But no matter how ambitious or successful he was, Mark still felt lonely. He longed for someone to share his life with, a partner he could love and build a future with. Then, in 2010, fate led him to Berlina Wallace, a meeting that seemed destined to bring him love, but instead plunged him into the depths of despair. That was the moment when all of Mark Van Dongen's dreams began to unravel. If Mark Van Dongen's past was a story of a talented and kind-hearted young man, then his relationship with Berlina Wallace was a descent into darkness, an entrapment in toxic love, manipulation, and violence, a love that ultimately destroyed his life in the most horrific way. In 2010, amidst the bustling city of Bristol, Mark met Berlina Wallace, a South African fashion student. At 48 years old, Wallace was nearly 20 years older than Mark, but the age difference didn't concern him. In her, he found charm, a strong personality, and what he believed to be a mature, profound relationship. In the early months, their love story seemed like something out of a romantic novel. They traveled together, shared intimate moments, and Mark even supported Wallace financially, believing it was simply what a good boyfriend should do. He cared for her deeply, but he had no idea that his nightmare had only just begun. Within months, Wallace revealed her true nature. She was irrationally jealous, obsessively controlling Mark's every move, from his calls and messages to the people he interacted with. Those who knew Wallace described her as short-tempered, aggressive, and psychologically manipulative. Her control over Mark was not just emotional, but also physical. She would scream, throw things, and in fits of rage, she even turned violent. Once, in a sudden and unprovoked outburst, she poured a kettle of boiling water on him while he slept. When Mark went to the hospital, he lied to the doctors, claiming he had burned himself while making tea, terrified of the consequences if he reported her. Mark's friends started noticing a change. Once a confident and energetic young man, he became withdrawn and anxious. When asked about Wallace, he would force a weak smile and evade the topic. But at times, scratches and bruises on his arms betrayed the escalating violence behind closed doors. Despite the manipulation, Mark wasn't blind to the warning signs. He tried to leave, but every time he did, Wallace would resort to emotional blackmail, threatening suicide, crying hysterically, and even blaming him for her own abusive behavior. He became trapped in a vicious cycle of love, control, and violence, unable to break free. After 5 years of suffering, in 2015, Mark finally gathered the courage to end the relationship. He confided in friends that he had met someone new, Violet Farrison, and that he wanted a fresh start. But Wallace refused to accept reality. She bombarded Mark with hundreds of messages, pleading, threatening, and cursing him. As he started dating Violet, Wallace's obsession spiraled. She stalked him, made anonymous phone calls, and threatened to ruin his life. His friends feared for his safety, but Mark never believed Wallace would actually act on her threats. He was wrong. On the night of September 22, 2015, when Mark agreed to meet Wallace one last time in an attempt to end things peacefully, he had no idea that the trap had already been set. And just hours later, his life would be changed forever in the most brutal way imaginable. Leaving a toxic relationship is never easy. For Mark Van Dongen, deciding to walk away from Berlina Wallace wasn't just about ending a relationship. It was a battle to reclaim his own life. But what he never anticipated was that the price of his freedom would be his very existence. Mark was no stranger to Wallace's emotional manipulation. For years, every time he mentioned breaking up, She would threaten suicide, blame him, or play the victim to reel him back in. But after 5 long years, he was exhausted. By the summer of 2015, he made up his mind. He would leave for good. He had found an escape, a glimmer of hope in Violet Farrison, a woman he believed could help him rebuild a peaceful life. But Wallace refused to be abandoned. The moment Mark declared the breakup, Wallace spiraled into instability. She became obsessed. Mark began receiving relentless messages, each escalating in intensity over time. At first, she pleaded, full of remorse, "Please give me another chance. I can't live without you." Then she blamed him. "You've destroyed my life." And finally she threatened, "You will regret this. I won't let you go." But it didn't stop at messages. He started receiving eerie, silent phone calls late at night. Whenever he answered, all he could hear was heavy breathing and an unsettling silence. Wallace began stalking him, appearing near his apartment unannounced. Violet, Mark's new girlfriend, also became a target, bombarded with anonymous messages and phone calls. Mark's friends were terrified for him. They urged him to cut Wallace off completely. But Mark, kind-hearted as ever, still felt responsible for her. He believed that if he remained civil, if he continued to support her financially, she would eventually let him go. He was wrong. On September 22, 2015, Wallace called Mark. Her voice was calm, eerily different from the past few weeks. "I understand now. You can go. I just want to see you one last time, to end things on good terms." Mark hesitated, but in the end, he agreed. He told Violet that he was going to meet Wallace to settle things once and for all. What he didn't know was that the moment he stepped into Wallace's apartment, he had already walked into a death trap. The bottle of acid was waiting, and Wallace had made her decision. If she couldn't have him, then no one could. At 3 a.m. on September 23, 2015, inside a small apartment in Bristol, England, Mark Van Dongen jolted awake. A wave of unease washed over him. The air in the room felt thick, suffocatingly silent. And then, in the dim light, he saw her. Berlina Wallace stood by the bed staring at him. Before he could react, he heard the words that would haunt him forever. "If I can't have you, then no one can." A shiver ran down his spine. But before he could move, a cold, viscous liquid came crashing down on his face, spilling over his chest, his arms, spreading across his entire body. And then came the pain. Not just any pain. This was agony beyond human endurance. Mark's screams shattered the stillness of the night as his skin began to disintegrate before his very eyes. For the first few seconds, he didn't understand what was happening. His vision blurred. His face felt like it was melting. And the pain, there were no words for it. He lurched out of bed, hands flailing in blind desperation, crashing into the wall before collapsing onto the floor. But every movement only made it worse. The acid seeped deeper, devouring him layer by layer. He tried to open his eyes, but it was like 1,000 knives stabbing straight into his corneas. His heart pounded wildly, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his mind spiraled into sheer terror. But one thought cut through the chaos. He had to get out. Now in excruciating pain, Mark crawled out of the bedroom, blindly searching for the exit. Behind him, Wallace stood motionless, watching, as if she were savoring the sight before her. Mark flung the door open and stumbled into the street, wearing nothing but his underwear. His screams tore through the silence, waking the neighbors. And then they saw him. The sight froze them in place. A man staggering down the pavement, his flesh peeling off in chunks, droplets of acid sizzling as they hit the ground. At first, some thought he was covered in mud, but when they realized the truth, a woman screamed. A man vomited on the spot, and another rushed back inside to fetch cold water. Mark tried to speak, but his mouth foamed, his voice twisted with pain. Berlina Wallace, she did this to me." A neighbor pulled him into their apartment, dragging him into the bathroom, desperately pouring water over his body, hoping, praying that it would stop the burning. But it was too late. The pain didn't subside. When paramedics arrived, they froze for a moment, stunned. They had never seen anything like this before. One medic would later recall, the skin on his face was almost completely gone. His eyes, and there was nearly nothing left. On the way to the hospital, Mark, barely clinging to consciousness, whispered, "Protect Violet. Don't let her hurt her." Meanwhile, inside her apartment, Berlina Wallace sat calmly, dialing a friend, unbothered by the screams that had echoed through the night. For Mark Van Dongen, this was only the beginning of 15 months of unimaginable suffering, a slow descent into a fate that was already sealed. The ambulance raced through the empty streets of Bristol, its flashing red and blue lights casting eerie reflections on the darkened buildings. Inside, Mark Van Dongen fought against a pain beyond comprehension. Though paramedics had drenched him in cold water to slow the acid's destruction, the damage was relentless. The sulfuric acid continued to eat away at his flesh, searing through muscle, burning down to the bone. The medics did everything they could to keep him conscious, but Mark could barely speak. His body convulsed violently from shock and agony. His eyelids no longer functioned. One paramedic peered closer and realized that his left iris had completely dissolved. "Stay with us, Mark. We're going to help you." But how could they help a man whose very body was betraying him, disintegrating with every passing second under the merciless attack of 98% sulfuric acid? When they arrived at Southmead Hospital, even the most seasoned doctors were stunned. They had treated severe burns before, but nothing prepared them for the horror before them. 25% of Mark's body had suffered catastrophic chemical burns, mainly on his face, neck, chest, and arms. One eye was completely destroyed, while the other was severely damaged. His skin had turned black with necrosis, the acid having burrowed through muscle and bone. Nerve endings were obliterated, leaving him with limited movement. Doctors rushed him into emergency care, administering powerful doses of morphine to dull the unimaginable pain. But even then, they weren't sure if he would survive the night. Meanwhile, the police had already arrived at the hospital. One officer leaned down, speaking gently yet firmly. "Who did this to you?" Despite teetering on the edge of death, Mark summoned what little strength remained and whispered, "Berlina Wallace, my ex-girlfriend." That was all they needed. A team of officers was immediately dispatched to Berlina Wallace's apartment. When they knocked, she didn't seem surprised. No panic, no attempt to cover up what she had done. Wallace sat calmly on her sofa, arms crossed, staring at them with chilling indifference. "I don't know what happened to him," she said flatly. The officers placed her under arrest on the spot. A search of her apartment revealed a bottle of unmarked acid, clear evidence that the attack had been premeditated. The crime scene told its own story: acid-stained floors, splashes on the bed, and residue in the bathroom. Every trace pointed to a meticulously planned assault. Wallace was taken into custody. Even as the handcuffs locked around her wrists, she showed no emotion, her face blank, as if none of it mattered. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, doctors placed Mark into a medically induced coma to stabilize his body before preparing for extensive skin grafts and long-term treatment. But even in the forced sleep of sedation, he couldn't escape the nightmare that had already claimed him. When Mark Van Dongen opened his eyes for the first time in 4 months, the world he once knew was gone. A sterile white ceiling, the rhythmic beeping of hospital machines. And worst of all, his body no longer belonged to him. The pain was still there, smoldering, burning like an eternal fire. But something far worse had happened. Mark couldn't move. He tried to lift his arm. Nothing. He tried to call for a nurse. His mouth only produced garbled, broken sounds. And then, reality hit like a death sentence. He was paralyzed from the neck down. A doctor stood beside his bed, his expression filled with sorrow. With practiced calm, he explained. The acid had severely damaged his nervous system, leaving him completely paralyzed. His left eye was completely destroyed, while his right eye retained only blurred remnants of vision. His left leg had been amputated below the knee due to necrosis. Chronic infections ravaged his body, making recovery nearly impossible. Mark didn't react. He simply lay there, drowning in agony as a tidal wave of despair swallowed him whole. Then he saw his reflection for the first time. Scars stretched across his face. His skin was grotesquely disfigured. One eye, empty, hollow. His mouth opened in silent horror before he whispered, his voice frail, trembling, "Kill me." Beside him, his father, Cornelius Kees Van Dongen, had never left his side. For 4 months, he had slept on rigid plastic chairs, eaten rushed meals, refusing to leave his son alone. He could care for Mark for the rest of his life, but he could not change this cruel, irreversible reality. As the days passed, Mark slipped further into depression. Every time he closed his eyes, the nightmares returned. The screams, the searing pain, the cold, expressionless face of Wallace. And when he woke, the nightmare continued. One day he looked at his father and said, "If all I can do is suffer and stare at the ceiling, I don't want to live anymore." Kees wept, but he did not argue. He knew Mark had no way out. In November 2016, Mark was transferred to a care facility in Gloucester. The conditions were unbearable. Kees drove 800 miles to visit him, only to find his son lying in filth, neglected, sobbing in despair. Enraged, he made a decision. He would take Mark home, to Belgium. There, under the country's euthanasia laws, Mark's suffering could finally end. After months of assessments, 3 specialized doctors confirmed what was undeniable. His pain, both physical and emotional, was beyond saving. On January 2nd, 2017, Mark spent his final moments with his father. Kees held his son's hand, his voice shaking, as Mark looked at him one last time. At 7:15 p.m., the doctor inserted the needle into Mark's vein. Seconds later, the nightmare was finally over. Nearly 3 years after the horrific attack, the perpetrator finally faced justice. April 2018, Bristol Crown Court was packed. Reporters, lawyers, and spectators filled the courtroom. Their collective anticipation thick in the air. This was no ordinary trial. It was a test of the British legal system. Berlina Wallace, the woman who had systematically destroyed Mark Van Dongen's life, entered the courtroom with cold, emotionless eyes. As the prosecutor read out the charges, the room fell silent. She stood accused of murder and grievous bodily harm with a corrosive substance. The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening statement was clear and damning. This was not a crime of impulse. This was a calculated, premeditated attack. Then they presented the irrefutable evidence. September 2nd, 2015. Wallace purchased a bottle of 98% sulfuric acid on Amazon. She deliberately removed the warning label, a clear attempt to conceal the deadly substance. She conducted 82 separate Google searches on acid attacks, their effects, and the lifelong suffering of victims. When arrested, she displayed zero remorse, zero concern for what she had done. The prosecution played the final testimony of Mark Van Dongen, recorded before his death. His frail, broken voice echoed through the courtroom. "Berlina Wallace, she did this to me." The room held its breath. Mark's father, Kees Van Dongen, sat motionless, his grief immeasurable. Yet Wallace remained indifferent. She pleaded not guilty to murder. Her defense? A shameless and absurd argument. She didn't know the bottle contained acid. She thought it was water. She claimed that Mark poured the acid on himself to frame her. When asked why she didn't call for help as he screamed in agony, she shrugged and said she had been too scared. The prosecution tore her lies apart. She had made no attempt to assist Mark, instead calling a friend as if nothing had happened. A psychological report revealed that Wallace had a history of destructive tendencies when angry. And if Mark had truly harmed himself, why had she researched acid attacks so obsessively beforehand? Despite the overwhelming evidence, as the judge's gavel struck the wooden bench, the courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. 12 years in prison. That was the sentence handed down to Berlina Wallace, the woman who had poured acid over Mark Van Dongen, condemning him to 15 months of living hell, stripping him of everything before forcing him to seek a merciful death. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the verdict hung in the air. Kees Van Dongen, Mark's grieving father, sat motionless, his hands clenched into tight fists, his eyes red-rimmed with silent fury. He had hoped for justice, but 12 years felt like an insult, a mere slap on the wrist for the unthinkable suffering his son had endured. Behind him, some shook their heads in disbelief. Others wept. Journalists scribbled frantically, capturing the reactions of those in attendance. But the only person in the room unmoved, unaffected, and indifferent was Berlina Wallace herself. No tears, no fear, no remorse. As security officers led her away, her gaze remained vacant, her expression unreadable, as if this had never been her fault. Public outrage erupts. The moment the verdict was announced, a firestorm of outrage exploded across social media and news outlets. 12 years! A disgracefully light sentence for someone who committed the most sadistic form of murder. A viral tweet shared thousands of times. If Mark had died immediately, Wallace would have been convicted of murder. But because he fought to survive for 15 months, the punishment is less severe? Where is the justice in that? A scathing op-ed questioned the legal system's failure. In the Netherlands, where Mark was born, newspapers fiercely criticized the British judicial system for failing to convict Wallace of murder. Some headlines labeled it a catastrophic failure of justice, while others warned that this verdict set a dangerous precedent, one that could embolden future acid attackers. But the outcry wasn't limited to just journalists and the public. A father's devastation. Outside the courtroom, Mark Van Dongen was visibly shaken, his voice raw with anguish as he spoke to reporters. "My son did not choose to die. She murdered him, and yet she gets only 12 years. This is not justice." His voice cracked as he expressed a chilling reality. Under UK sentencing laws, Wallace could be released in just 6 years. 6 years? She stole Mark's life, and in a few years, she will walk free while we are left with nothing but grief. For Keyes, this wasn't justice. It was a betrayal. The case that changed the law. The Van Dongen case sent shockwaves through Britain's legal system, sparking fierce debates about the treatment of acid attacks under the law. Previously, acid attacks had been viewed as grievous bodily harm rather than an act tantamount to murder. But Mark's unimaginable suffering and slow, agonizing death forced lawmakers to confront the true horror of chemical violence. Politicians demanded harsher penalties. Some called for acid attacks to be prosecuted as murder, regardless of whether the victim died instantly or later succumbed to their injuries. Under mounting public pressure, the UK government passed the Offensive Weapons Act 2019, which restricted the sale of corrosive substances, making them harder to obtain. Introduced life sentences for acid attackers, ensuring harsher punishments. Treated acid as a deadly weapon, acknowledging its capacity to inflict lifelong suffering. Though the law changed, it came too late for Mark. She took his life, but she will walk free. For Mark's friends and family, no sentence could ever undo what had been done. One of his closest friends gave an emotional interview. Mark lost everything: his future, his dreams, his dignity. And Wallace? She'll get out. She'll get to live. Where is the justice in that? But one thing was certain. Berlina Wallace may one day walk out of prison, but she would never escape the weight of what she had done. Because to the world, she would never be a woman scorned, never be a victim of love. She would forever be a cold-blooded murderer, a killer without a knife, who destroyed a man, one drop of acid at a time. The case of Mark Van Dongen was more than just a personal tragedy. It became a turning point that forced the British legal system to confront the horrific reality of acid attacks. From a controversial verdict to public outrage, from legal reforms to his family's relentless fight for justice, Mark's death left behind a bitter yet profound legacy. When Berlina Wallace received her 12-year sentence, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. For some, the punishment seemed absurdly light. For Mark Van Dongen, Mark's grieving father, it was a betrayal of justice. Mark was tortured for 15 months before he died. She killed him. 12 years is far too little, he told reporters, his voice breaking. But he did not stop at outrage. He turned his pain into a fight to change the law, to ensure that no one else would suffer as his son had. The legal loophole that failed Mark. At the heart of the case lay a critical legal dilemma. If Mark had died immediately, Wallace would have faced a murder conviction. But because he survived for 15 months before choosing euthanasia, prosecutors had to prove that Wallace was legally responsible for his death. Under UK law, a person can only be convicted of murder if their actions directly cause the victim's death. Because Mark opted for euthanasia in Belgium, prosecutors could not legally argue that Wallace had killed him under British law. This loophole ignited fierce debate. Should an attacker be able to escape a murder charge simply because their victim didn't die immediately? Mark's case exposed a flaw in the justice system, one that many argued needed urgent reform. The call for justice sparks change. Following the trial, lawmakers and legal experts called for urgent changes. If a victim dies as a direct result of an attack, whether immediately or after months of suffering, the attacker should still be charged with murder. Public pressure mounted on the UK government, demanding stricter laws to prevent similar injustices. As a result, the UK introduced the Offensive Weapons Act 2019, which tightened regulations on acid sales, restricting access to high-concentration corrosives, banned the sale of acid to minors under 18, imposed harsher sentences for acid attacks, treating them as acts akin to murder. These changes drastically reduced acid attacks across the UK. But for Mark's family, legal reform was not justice. A new conversation on domestic violence. Beyond legal changes, Mark's case shattered societal assumptions about abuse. For years, domestic violence had been seen primarily as a women's issue. But Mark's story forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Men can also be victims. Mark's experience revealed how men, too, can suffer emotional, psychological, and physical abuse. His case exposed the failures of domestic abuse support systems, which often overlook male victims. Following the case, several domestic violence charities in the UK expanded their outreach to support male victims, acknowledging a reality that had long been ignored. The Justice for Mark campaign emerged, demanding better protections for men trapped in abusive relationships. A pain that never fades. Despite these changes, justice still feels incomplete for those who knew Mark. At the apartment building where the attack took place, the doorbell Mark rang that night still bears the scars of the acid, a permanent reminder of his suffering. Mark Van Dongen continues his fight for stricter laws, holding on to one unwavering belief: no one should suffer the way my son did. A question that haunts the system. Mark Van Dongen did not die in vain. His case changed laws, transformed societal awareness, and forced the UK to take acid attacks more seriously. But one question remains unanswered. Can justice truly exist when a woman who destroyed a man's life, drop by drop, serves only 12 years in prison? This question still haunts the British legal system and everyone who followed the case from the very beginning. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoy the way we present these stories, don't forget to like, share, and follow to support the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next video.